Hi, thank you for joining Make It Happen for Gen Z, a webinar about creating personal value in the food and beverage space for America's youngest generation. Just a couple housekeeping reminders before we get started and while we let people, they're still joining in. Your lines are muted as we are recording the session, and we've actually got tremendous response, and so we've got a lot of people. So everybody can hear, the line is muted, but we don't want to discourage you from interacting with us. So please feel free at any time using the chat function to send us questions. Locke and I will be taking questions at the end of our time together. Also, we want to let you know that we will be emailing the slides from today's webinar tomorrow morning, so you will have the materials. And if anyone is interested in the recording, please feel to reach out to either one of us. I will share out our contact information at the end of today's talk. We're going to have about 30 minutes worth of content unless we just get overly excited. We'll try and keep it to that, and then we'll have time for Q&A. But who are we? So after all that housekeeping, let me introduce myself. I'm Susan Schwally. I'm an executive director in our food and beverage practice at the MPD Group. And I'm really excited to have a special guest here today from one of our partner companies, Culture Waves. I have Locke Hildebrand, who is their Chief Insights Officer with me.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So we're really excited to talk to you about Gen Z but what I want to do first is just ask your patience about 30 seconds more with one last housekeeping item. I want to talk a little bit about Culture Waves and one of the other folks that helped us out with some of the qualitative insights you're going to see today, and then we're going to dive into the insights. Most of you are probably familiar with MPD. We've been tracking food and beverage consumption behaviors for 30-plus years now. And we understand the attitudes, behaviors, and needs of consumers. We do a great job at answering the who, what, where, when, how, and also why of eating and drinking. But one of the things that we love to do is bring the behaviors to life by partnering with such folks as Culture Waves. So I'm going to ask Locke just to give us a couple comments about what he does.
Sure. So Culture Waves, we've been around for over 10 years. We are a qualitative research group. Really, we look at the why behind the what, so to speak. We track needs and consumer needs and how those needs are related to culture, to services, to products, to goods through our own independent software that we have created. And for us, it's all about telling a deeper, bigger consumer story about what those needs really are and how we can get to and address those consumer needs.
And Culture Waves and Locke and the team were really instrumental in helping us understand the Gen Z mindset behind some of these behaviors and help us really triangulate and say, yep, that is in fact what's driving the behavior. I also want to mention Watch Me Think, another partner that helps us bring the voice of the consumer to the insights. So this is another way that we overlay some qualitative insights on the consumer behavior. And we went out and talked to several Gen Z. Today I'm just going to feature one of the Gen Zers and show you a couple clips of things that tie into the couple points we're trying to make today. So with that, let's turn our attention to Gen Z and learn a little bit more about them. So as I mentioned, we published a study about Gen Z last month because the front end of this generation is turning 21 years old this year. And we're in a really unique perspective to understand them because we understand what individuals consume from the moment they arrive on this planet. So by individual year of age, we can tell you as they go from being an infant to a toddler to preschool to grade school, how that changes as they enter their teens and as Gen Z enters adulthood. So that behavior, that rich behavior is available to trend in size and quantify what's going on with this generation that's different from other generations, and then we're bringing the qualitative piece in. So we really are excited here to bring to you, hopefully, a holistic view on the generation. As I mentioned, Gen Z is right at the front end of their buying power. There's lots of reasons. I'm going to give you the numbers why you should be thinking about them. Locke's going to give you some other pretty compelling reasons why they're important, whether you're a food service operator, a food manufacturer, whatever the case may be. But Gen Z now outnumbers the millennials. And for a lot of us, millennials are still top of mind, and of course should be. But the fact that there's 86 million Gen Z coming behind them, that they are almost a third of the population, and even though they haven't gotten into their adulthood and working years, they're already at $44 billion in buying power, so that will just continue to increase.
Yeah, and one of the things when you look at Gen Z and you look at millennials and you think about what the differentiators there are starting to look like, the big thing is millennials change the message and how things are going and what the expectations were, and those expectations are already in place for Gen Z. So they're not going backwards, they're going to be moving forward. So it's going to be very interesting looking at this generation as they grow up and what their next range of expectations are, jumping off of what millennials have already established. Right,
exactly. And so I just want to make a couple comments to make sure we're all on the same page with the group of folks that we're talking about. The young Gen Z this year in 2018 are up to 11 years of age, and the older Gen Z are turning 21. And you can see there from 1997 to present is the group that was formed. And really one of the main questions why we're looking at Gen Z right now is it's very easy to assume that they're just going to carry on millennial behaviors. But that's a real easy assumption to make. And I think one of the things, Locke, that you just mentioned was the millennials have put it in place. It's already here for Gen Z. What will they do with it moving forward? They're going to be different.
Right, and that's kind of looking at from engagement to how brands are coming to fruition to even how they're selling themselves to Gen Z. It's a changing dynamic environment because, as I had mentioned, we're not going backwards from what millennials have put in place. And with them being such a tech-fluent generation, things are going to have to adapt to where they're living and what their mindset is as they move forward.
Right. So some of the things that differentiate Gen Z, just big picture from millennial, is the fact that they are the most ethnically diverse generation in the history of our country. And this impacts them in many, many different ways.
Yeah, so, these guys have grown up with a global food palette. They have grown up connected to the world in a way that no one could ever have imagined. So not only from a cultural standpoint are they very different because they're just assimilating cultures into their life on a day-to-day basis, whether they know it or not, but it's also impacting, what innovation looks like for them, because innovation can essentially be anything because they live in this global mindset.
Right. Tying into that, this is the first generation that really is technology inherent. We know that, the millennials had it. It came on stream while they were growing up, but, this is the generation that understands touchscreen from the get-go and understands voice activated.
Yeah, these guys could use an iPad before they could write their name, which is daunting and kind of crazy to think of because for millennials it was kind of the Wild West of the internet, and millennials adapted to what the internet was, versus these guys, the internet is being tailored and designed for them and to them.
Right. And also, to that extent, they have unlimited content, right? But they don't have any more time than the rest of us do, right? They don't get extra time. And some of the things you hear from, they believe that they are more than anyone else able to multitask. I think you have an average of 8 seconds to grab their attention. They feel they can process and sum something up. And also, I just want to mention the last thing is that a lot of times, I know when I think about Gen Z, I have just assumed that, the millennials are their parents. But, that's really the majority of Gen Z have a Gen X parent. And that's really a different mindset than the millennials who are raised by boomers. So pardon my rather stereotypical example, but a lot of boomers raised the millennials that they were a special flower, a special unique flower. The Gen Xers, a lot of them are raising Gen Z to understand who they are, what their strengths are, and how to use that to navigate this complex world.
Yeah, so if you think about it, with baby boomers, it was the world is your oyster. To millennials and for Gen X and Gen Z, it's this is the world and this is how you can fit into it.
Right.
So it's a very, very different mindset. It's a much more applicable instead of aspirational.
Right, and I've heard pragmatic be a word used to describe Gen Z. So, you know, that's the background, broad strokes on them. But let's talk a little bit more about what drives value and as it relates to brand loyalty with Gen Z, because there's a little bit of a shift here too in terms of how they interact with brands. And ultimately, what this report looks at is once we understand what drives them, we dive down into 4 different topic areas. So I'm going to let Locke take this away. This is really fascinating. But it's more so that Gen Z, it's really about what the brand can do for them.
Yeah, and this is really one of the biggest changes for them generationally as a whole, is that for Gen Z, a brand is an extension of who they are. It's a part of their personality. It's almost a living, ongoing part of their persona. They are looking for brands that represent and reflect who they are, which is a big differentiator compared to millennials, where brands were very much a status symbol. And it was all about that idea of I'm buying into brands because I love them and I want to be a part of that brand's legacy. Or even looking up into Gen X, where it was that idea that a brand is relatable, it's reliable, it's something that's always been there. And then thinking about boomers and that idea that brands represented this enduring sign of quality. So when you look at Gen Z and how for them it's about if the brand isn't who I am, do I need it? That's a very, very different case than looking at quality or legacy or it being a status symbol.
Right, right. So how does this translate into food and beverage? So what are the ways that we can all be creating personal value for Gen Z as they come on board and, flex their spending muscle? So several people have, including MPD, have quantified brand loyalty, Gen Z versus millennials. And all the numbers I've seen that they're very, very close, within a percentage point or 2 of each other. So, you can say Gen Z are as brand disloyal as millennials, but it's really driven by some different reasons. So first of all, if we think about food, the point that we made earlier that the internet is already here and created for them, Gen Z are already being born into a foodie culture. If you think about what's been building over the last couple decades, whether it's the celebrity chefs, the cooking show, the rising, global cuisine and innovation, they come into that world. They come into a culture that's already geared that way.
Yeah, so food has essentially become pop culture for them. You see it on Netflix, you see it on a multitude of platforms, and alongside of that, their parents are growing up alongside them as foodies in the sense that, they're seeing ancient grains and quinoa and all of these things start hitting the grocery store. So they're thinking, oh, I'm going to try that on the dinner table. Well, guess what? Their kid is eating it as well. So that's where this whole idea of unintentional foodies is really starting to come into play, is they're accidentally getting access to very adult foods and flavors at very young ages.
And also, Gen Z, they're told at a very early age what their food can do for them. And some of this has to do with the schools and the changes that have been made in terms of talking about nutrition. But they're very aware of the functional benefits of foods, as well as this group is very aware of which kids have which food allergies or sensitivities in the classroom. My 7-year-old, I almost sent him to school with peanuts, and he just chastised me up and down, and he can name the kids. So one of the things we talk about in the report we're not going to today is this idea of niche diets, highly personalized, individualized diets, either by choice or by need. Because they understand what their food can do for them and provide some sort of function for them, they've grown up with this emphasis on that, as well as flavor is always important, and that's tied to discovery and global and experience. But flavor and function have come to the forefront rather than brand in many instances, which can also explain why unknown or small or niche brands are very quickly able to come into the marketplace and flourish. So there are 4 different ways that we believe the food and beverage and food service industry can create value for Gen Z. And today, Locke and I are going to spend some time exploring the idea of fluidity, which is about, if I had to pick a slogan or a mantra, it's for Gen Z, it's meet me where I am. It's all about immediacy. It's all about what I need in the moment, whatever I'm doing. Doesn't matter what the day part is necessarily. It's in that moment. So they are redefining what meals and snacking look like. And also, from a retail perspective, they're also redefining how shopping is being conducted. Authenticity is really about transparency in food. Also, the movement towards fresh and real, as well as the story that the brand tells in an authentic way to represent who they are, so that Gen Z can determine if it's a reflection of them. Individuality touches on a lot of different things, but it's this idea of personalization in food, whether that's in terms of how you're able to actually get or construct what you're eating, as well as the choices that you make from specialized diets and food preferences. And then discovery is all about engaging them in experiences, the experiential and flavor and global, and those kinds of things. But we're gonna focus on fluid. So let's dive in. Meet me where I am. A couple things that are unique to this generation about fluidity in food and beverages, and these are all rather interrelated. As I mentioned, it's really about what's available to me and what's my own personal need in the moment. So that means it's tearing apart the traditional boundaries between meals and snacks and the roles that foods play in those. And I think we've been watching this trend, all of us in the industry have been watching this trend for quite some time. But Gen Z is masterful at making the mashup or the bento box lunch or whatever you want to call it to get that done. Related to that, that means also this idea of eating specific foods or beverages at a certain time of day is going away and is blurring.
And one of the big things that we see with that is looking at breakfast and how as breakfast on one hand becomes more snackable and snack-oriented, at the same time breakfast as a flavor is pushing into other times of the day and into other meal types. You know, you have everything from sausage and egg dumplings appearing on menus now to that idea that breakfast is becoming less of a day part and more of a cluster of flavors, which really speaks to that idea that it's like, I want what I want when I want it, and I don't care what form it comes in as long as I get it.
Right. And it also translates to retail in terms of I want what I want when I want it, and what's the platform that's going to get it for me that makes the most sense in that moment. So there's a blurring, a fluidity, I guess I should say, between brick and mortar, e-com, social media. It really is truly omnichannel. So let's hear from our first Gen Zer. Her name is Joanina. A couple quick background. She's 20 years old, but it's interesting. She is a student. She lives with her family, but she is the primary food shopper for the family. Here she's going to talk more, though, about what her day is structured like, and then we'll revisit her on the retail side. So what's interesting about that is clearly what comes out in her day is she talks about the importance of snacking, and she talks about having 5 kind of mini meals throughout the day. But it's interesting because she talks about the snack getting her to the the occasion, the meal that has a larger portion. And she's still describing it by breakfast snack, lunch snack, dinner snack. So there is some traditional structure that is there, but what is really interesting is this idea that snacks are so integrated and premeditated.
Yeah, and that's something that, you know, is becoming very clear with Gen Z, is this idea of premeditating everything. You know, this is the age group that as kids, they have Fitbits, and they're looking at personal metrics, and they're able to analyze on a day-to-day basis, if they want, what their output is and able to minimize and maximize things. And that's going down into snacking now, where they're wanting to minimize, maximize their meals, their hunger, whatever the case may be, that fits them for the day, so they're premeditating them.
Right. And there's a couple interesting things going on from a behavioral perspective. So, you know, if I looked at this same information, if we looked at it together that I'm showing you for teens, for the front end of Gen Z, and we looked at the trend in the average number of items that they're assembling or putting together to make their breakfast, lunch, dinner, and between meal occasions, we would see some different patterns. Dinner would be simplifying in terms of there'd be fewer items. It'd be going the opposite direction. Same with lunch, actually. But what we see with Gen Z across the board is they're actually increasing. This generation is increasing the average number of food items that they're using to create their main meals and their snacks. So, what's interesting about that? The reality is that they're using ready-to-eat and already prepared foods and assembling them together to create these meals. So while it may look like they're spending more time putting things together, in fact, it's the convenience of the food, as well as some of the other things going on in the kitchen that's making it happen. So about 6 in 10 of their eating occasions do not use an appliance, and this is much higher than the millennials and Gen Xers. Now, I understand that these guys are, full grown adults supplying food for other people yet, but this is an interesting trend.
Yeah, you know, these guys are kind of like the kings of piecemealing things together, is that it's part of that whole push that they are growing up in an age where if they have access to the pieces and parts, whatever it may be, right, they will figure out the solution and put it together.
So let's talk a little bit about snacking, because they definitely are changing this area. We're going to just spend some moment on the things related to fluidity, but you can see there's things going on in other areas that drive value for them. Block, I'm going to hand it over to you to comment on this.
Sure. So the first thing really to think about is what I just mentioned, that idea of piecemealing and putting the components together. It's really crazy, this idea that they no longer are playing by the rules of day parts. Like if they can figure out how to make something they want and it's delicious and it's quick and it gets them what they need, they're willing to do it and they will do it. You know, they expect to be able to get any kind of food at any time of day, whether it's they have to go get it themselves or they find a way to get it to them. And they're inherently mobile. You know, we've talked about that this is the generation that the internet is being tailored for, and they expect their food to travel with them, so that affects what their packaging looks like, how they get it, where they get it, and even, you know, why they're getting it. All of that is coming into play whenever it comes to this idea of mobility for them.
Right. I love the example we were talking about on taking food to go, that there's restaurants that are starting to ask, how are you traveling, how far are you going, and they're changing the packaging to make it truly mobile and work. I'm going to quickly talk about some of the foods and different things so that you can keep on with your day. But with the youngest kids, it's not surprising that we see snack foods in this generation are about they like it, it's a favorite, there was a health, and there's no particular reason. This is a lot of mindless munching. It's snacks between meals to get them to the next meal. We see satiating come into play with the grade school age kids. You start to see Tide Me Over come in. But what's really interesting is when you get up to the Gen Z teens and the adults, Tide me over definitely, as Jo and Nina said, to get her from one meal to the other, almost a mini meal, but also the idea of entertainment and experience with fun and satisfying a craving or a specific taste comes into play. Just a brief comment here on lunch and fluidity. You know, what we see is that snack foods are really entering the lunch occasion very strongly in terms of assembling and pulling them together to create that lunch, no matter where they are. So that's really the big piece of fluidity. And I just briefly want to talk about here what are the top 5 growing foods that we see being eaten in home by Gen Z at lunch. And it's a mix of things. Among the youngest kids, what I thought was most interesting here is packaged lunch kits would be like a Lunchable. There's certainly new entries into that arena, which is, you know, the first version of the lunch bento box. But then also you've got some pretty protein rich and hearty dishes like egg dishes, frozen sandwiches, mac and cheese. It doesn't change too much with grade school age kids, although you see fruit and vegetables come in. But interestingly, again, when we get to the teens, you see things that really are more like main dish items, that are main dish items moving up, like that reflect the global cuisine, as well as rice dishes, where the rice or the grain may be a host for other ingredients, and those egg dishes again. And then on the beverage side, tap water is the fastest growing thing, I believe, again, really across the entire population. But even amongst young kids, tap water is at the top of the list. We do see carbonated soft drinks, non-diet, on the list, but take note, they're not the top growing thing, and I think that's because that category has had declines and is just stabilizing. If you look at everything else on this list, it's really highly functional. Smoothies, drinkable yogurt, nutrition protein drinks. And then if you look up into the teens, you see the non-dairy alternatives come in, like the almond milk, and specialty coffee, really big in this group. Okay, so let's turn to the digital world, and let's talk about different ways they're sourcing meals.
Yeah, so on one hand, you have this idea of shelf-stable meal solutions growing, and what's interesting is it's sort of changing for them. For them, you're getting to shelf-stable kits more, and you're seeing more that sort of like half-scratch blend of where they can have a part in the process, but they don't have to necessarily do the whole thing themselves. Looking at meal plans and subscription services and how it's blown up, and it was a big delivery system, and now it's starting to appear in grocery stores and becoming even more accessible. You know, looking at chatbots and automated app services, which is completely changing the way that we're approaching delivery and ordering, because now we're able to get food without ever even interacting with a person. Looking at expanded ordering and delivery services, and that idea that now delivery services are trying to find new ways to reach even smaller scale restaurants and being able to make more food and more flavors even more accessible than before. And we're getting into this point, as Susan had mentioned earlier, where the restaurant is just the place you pick up the food. There isn't even anything beyond a kitchen there. And the same thing's happening with online grocery, where you're seeing online grocers starting to offer perishables and meats. All of this is now coming to the doorstep and intersecting them at home, whereas once they had to go out of their way or go out through the day to be able to get it.
And the craziest thing, not food specific, but I was reading yesterday that Amazon is testing out delivering to your car trunk. So talk about getting it to right where you are. You know, we do track the online shopping, the incidence of it, and what we're able to see is that the millennials are the strongest when we talk about online grocery retailers or delivery service like Instacart. But what you see very quickly is Gen Z here coming on strong, and again, the front end of this is 21 years of age. They haven't even hit that full stride of coming of age in their spending power. So this is just going to continue to go up. And I just quickly want to, let's revisit with Jo and Nina and have her talk a little bit about the way she shops. Just a reminder, to please turn your PC speakers on. So all kinds of interesting things in there if we kind of unpack what she said. But one of the things that struck me up front was, I know when I was 20 years old, now first of all, granted, I wasn't the primary shopper for my family at that point, but I was not that price conscious or that savvy to know that, comparing Amazon Prime to boxed and distinguishing based on what my needs were at that time to figure out which channel to use. The other thing that I think was so interesting for her was that Grubhub gave her access to the small, independent, different types of foods or cuisines or whatever craving that she had. It gave her that kind of access.
And she called it out that it's because it works really well, which I think is another one of those different mindsets, that it's not because of what I can get, it's because of how well it works. And that's another kind of changing dynamic for them on Fluidity, is it's like whatever works the best is the platform that they're moving to use.
So some things that we know just in general in terms of our mobile world, 3 out of 10 online grocery orders were on a mobile app. And that's just only going to continue to grow. And that we know the younger the adult, the more likely they were to use a mobile device. So just some numbers to frame that up. So, Locke, did you want to add something to that?
Well, we were talking the other day about just the fact that mobile is becoming so impactful and how all of these things are changing. And one of the things that was really funny is we got in this short conversation about how there was this discussion on mommy blogs about essentially that you've done wrong at dinner whenever you call your kids to dinner and they come down and say, I'm not hungry, and then 10 minutes later Uber Eats shows up at the door with food for them that they paid for with their allowance.
Right.
And it's just crazy to think in that concept that they will find another route to get what they want or need, even if they have something existing, at present for them. They will find a way to make it happen.
Right. And the other one, which isn't food related, but that has just been mind-blowing, that Locke and I have been talking about now for several days, is I don't know if you're aware that there is a 12-year-old that managed to make it from the United States to Bali using his mother's credit card. And he was savvy enough to get online, research the airlines, understand who would let him fly without accompaniment, and get it all done and get halfway around the world. So, that goes back to tech inherent. So, of course, why wouldn't it apply to getting the dinner that you want in the moment that you want it, right? So what does this all mean? So in terms of, meeting Gen Z where they are and this need for fluidity, first of all, it's still convenience. It's just convenience in a little bit of a different way. It's always been convenience for all the generations along the way, but portability and flexible formats, and I would even say, even beyond single serve or resealable formats, a package design that really helps Gen Z experience the food or the beverage how it's meant to be experienced on the go.
And for the longest time, especially with millennials, access and convenience were sort of two separate roads, where one was about getting something when you want it, and one was about getting it when it's easiest for you. And for these guys, that's the same thing. Those two worlds have merged together for them.
And we haven't even touched today on what goes on at dinner and the changes there where there is the most interaction. But stay tuned, because we're already working together on something on that. But granted, our focus has been a lot today on snacking because it's so key right now to this day part. The other thing is as we've mentioned, the concept of clockless or anytime, so the blurring day parts, and whatever they want in the moment. I mean, clearly McDonald's had this figured out quite some time ago now when they added breakfast all day. And then the third piece of it is just frictionless retail. It has to work well and be seamless. Also, online, offline, it doesn't matter, whatever's going to meet the need. But there are going to be times when they want a direct connection. They also want a tactile connection with the brands, right? So there is a role for brick and mortar, certainly.
Yeah, and if you think about this outside of food, someone who's knocking this concept out of the park across all three is, looking at things like the Nintendo Switch. And the thing that has made it so popular is because it is the same experience regardless of if it's at home, if it's on a bus, on a train, on a plane, wherever that experience goes, it's just as good as it was in the previous place. And that's one of the biggest things about them is that idea that that fluidity and seamlessness has to go with them wherever, across every channel and across everything that they engage with.
Right. So before we get to the Q&A, you just wanted to leave you with some examples of how millennials have changed the brand story, but Gen Z is changing the brand engagement. So, Locke, you were the one that found the White Castle, plant-based White Castle. I'm going to give you the honors of talking about these because it's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Just Crack an Egg is kind of, it's brilliant, and we have been, like, we can't get them on store shelves long enough for me to even get one in a store. Like, every time I go, they're gone. And the thing that's been so great and what we've seen a lot of reception to is it fulfills that convenience need, but at the same time, it also fulfills that access need because of the level of portability that it has to offer. And it's kind of that new take on what breakfast can be. So it's a new type of breakfast engagement. The White Castle one is sort of changing the concept of what the traditional White Castle experience is to making it accessible to consumers with unique or niche diets or to someone that just wants a healthier option. So they're able to engage with a whole new audience and then engage with an audience that wants something that's just a little bit better at the same time. And if you haven't heard of or seen Domino's new announcement of the hotspots, this is a really cool idea that really applies to that convenience and access, where Domino's is mapping out, I believe it's 150,000 locations across the U.S. that are non-traditional addresses, so stadiums, parks, beaches, where you can now have a pizza delivered. So that idea of immediacy to now being able to come to you without you even having an address, you know, is just another example of how the engagement innovation is changing for these guys.
So, you know, we've scratched the surface on one of the 4 areas about how to create value for Gen Z, and some of it has touched on other things like, you know, authenticity and plant-based, and there's a lot of topics that we cover in the report. I do want to give you one shameless plug for the report. We are offering a bonus insights on the different day parts. If any of you care to purchase the Gen Z report it would be a week from tomorrow, by May 4th. We would give you broken down by the age groups, the top food and beverages. It's actually the fastest growing and declining, so you can see what's trending up and what they're walking away from, as well as some of the mindset that they have about the different occasions. Also, there's our contact information. Either Locke or I are happy to follow up whether you're interested in the recording or have one-off questions. And I'm going to take a look at the questions we may have gotten in, and we'll spend a little time on Q&A. Actually, we have quite a few questions, so thank you for that. Interesting. Here's one that talks about surprised about the brand perception for Gen X as reliable habit, yet they are the most innovative group, which feels like their orientation to brands is a critic of sorts, which is quite different from reliable habit.
And one of the things that is interesting, and the reason that we really look at that idea of reliability is because if you think of Gen X and that idea of sort of being the original TV generation as well as the MTV generation, is that that's when brands had a very, very strong impact in the home and coming into the home through traditional advertising. And it started to set in place that concept of what we now refer to as legacy brands, where it was very much for them a quick way to not have to necessarily try to make a decision on the fly as to what to get. There's an immediacy of, oh, I know this brand, it's good, I'll just go grab it, and then I'll take it home, and that's what I've always known, and therefore it's convenient and it's considered good to me.
The other thing that we know about this group is for a lot of them, they're right between having a family, a lot of times older kids, as well as being maybe an empty nester household that's busy and on the go. And so a lot of it's about finding solutions, ways to feed everyone and deal with all the different schedules. So that's something we see. I apologize that some of you had an issue with the audio. Let's see. Any thoughts on how Gen Z might support the shopping malls? Well, that's been a tough.
It has. It's a great question because malls are trying to rediscover really what their core audience is and what they can offer. And you're starting to see innovation around malls as an experience and what malls have to offer. Like if you look at anything, West Coast is really pushing outdoor malls that have anything from augmented reality experiences to 3D theaters, and trying to figure out a way to combine all these different elements of pop culture together that we've grown to expect. So food culture, entertainment culture, and then traditional retail shopping, and how do you blur the line between all of them? Where once it was sort of like you had the food court at one end of the mall, and then it was all shopping, and then maybe a movie theater at the other end. Now you're seeing these experiential events interspersed within the retail occasions as well as food.
Right. And you're also seeing a lot of pop-up kind of stores and different things that help drive like a kind of a limited engagement kind of thing popping up. We've talked about Alamo a lot the last 24 hours, and that to me is an example. It's like a corollary, what you're talking about, making shopping experiential to making movies experiential, and also bringing pop culture back into it, and then having souvenirs or things that were in the movie, whether it's Ferris Bueller's Day Off or a new movie, that there's a takeaway.
There's a tie,
There's a tie-in, so that's a really interesting thing. We have a question about the definition of Gen Z. So, this really goes to the point that Gen Z is a very broad range, and there's probably another generation yet to be fully named and defined with the younger kids within it. Some people are saying that Gen Z are only 13 to 21. We've extended it further, but that's also one of the reasons why throughout the report we've broken down Gen Z into younger and older, because there's so much change that happens from, birth to age 21. So we acknowledge that.
Yeah, and, if you look at it the way the guardrails for how they define millennials were set up, where you have your older millennials who grew up offline and then engaged with the internet as they entered junior high, and then you had younger millennials who grew up with the internet. That sort of mindset of how tech can change the game is something that's being really explored with Gen Z, because one of the reasons there hasn't been a soft cap put on the youngest group yet is we don't know where that sort of like next big wave of innovation is going to hit yet. So they haven't sort of soft capped the bottom level of that generation. And one of the reasons why they're calling this sort of like the 13 to 21 the end cap is because right now that's what a lot of people have tracked information on, and that's been the most easily accessible information as opposed to being able to look at them through this lens of across the entire age group.
Right, and get an idea of what's coming even beyond. Yep, that'll be very interesting to watch. Well, with that, you've been very generous with your time. I think we've answered all the questions, and as I mentioned, Locke or I are more than happy if you have anything that you want to follow up with us on one-on-one. And thank you for your attendance and participation today.